wet, moist, damp, soaked, drenched, dripping, saturated. These words all describe things covered with or full of liquid, especially water. Wet, covered with or full of liquid, especially water. The car had skidded on the wet road. You will get wet if you go out now. Moist, slightly wet, often in a way that is pleasant or useful. A lovely, rich, moist cake. Damp, slightly wet, often in a way that is unpleasant. The cottage was cold and damp. Soaked, rather informal. Very wet. You were soaked through. Drenched, very wet. We were caught in the storm and came home drenched to the skin. Soaked or drenched. Both of these words can be used with or in. Soaked with sweat. Soaked in sweat. Drenched with sweat. Drenched in sweat. Soaked with blood. Drenched in blood. Soaked in blood. Drenched in blood. Soaked but not usually. Drenched can also be used before a noun. Their soaked clothes, but you cannot say their drenched clothes. Dripping, not usually before noun. Very wet. Her face was dripping with sweat. His clothes were still dripping wet. Note: dripping is almost always used in one of these two patterns. Saturated, very wet. The ground is completely saturated. It would be pointless to plant anything. Patterns and collocations. Wet with something. Moist with something. Damp with something. Soaked with something. Drenched with something. Dripping with something. Saturated with something. Soaked in something. Drenched in something. Saturated in something. To be wet, to be moist, to be damp, to be soaked, to be drenched, to be saturated. To get wet, to get moist, to get damp, to get soaked, to get drenched, to get saturated. Somebody's coat is damp. Somebody's coat is wet. Somebody's shirt is wet. Somebody's coat is damp. Somebody's shoes are wet. Somebody's shoes are damp. Somebody's clothes are wet. Somebody's clothes are damp. Somebody's hair is wet. Somebody's hair is damp. Somebody's coat is soaked. Somebody's coat is drenched. Somebody's coat is dripping. Somebody's coat is saturated. Somebody's shirt is soaked. Somebody's shirt is drenched. Somebody's coat is dripping. Somebody's coat is saturated. Somebody's shoes are soaked. Somebody's shoes are drenched. Somebody's shoes are dripping. Somebody's shoes are saturated. Somebody's clothes are soaked. Somebody's clothes are drenched. Somebody's clothes are saturated. Somebody's clothes are dripping. Somebody's clothes are saturated. Somebody's hair is soaked. Somebody's hair is drenched. Somebody's hair is dripping. Somebody's hair is saturated. Wet ground, wet soil, wet earth. Moist ground, moist soil, moist earth. Damp ground, damp soil, damp earth. Saturated ground, saturated oil, saturated earth. A wet cloth, a moist cloth, a damp cloth. Really wet, really moist, really damp, really soaked, really drenched, really saturated. Very wet, very moist, very damp. A bit wet, a bit moist, a bit damp. A little wet, a little moist, a little damp. Quite moist, quite damp, quite wet. Rather wet, rather moist, rather damp. Absolutely soaked, absolutely drenched, absolutely saturated, absolutely wet. Completely soaked, completely drenched, completely saturated. Wet through, soaked through. Soaked to the skin, drenched to the skin.